Here is a question that sounds simple. What is a horse? You probably have an answer. You can picture one of the shape of the neck, the way the legs move, the sound of hooves. You feel certain you would recognize a horse if you saw one. So, what is a horse? Now, what is a white horse? Is it a horse? Of course it is, you say. A white horse is a horse that happens to be white. Obviously, there is no puzzle here. But a man named Gongsun Long, who lived in ancient China around 300 BCE, looked at that sentence, "A white horse is a horse," and said, "No, that is not correct. A white horse is not a horse." And he could prove it. He argued this position at royal courts. He debated scholars and ministers. He defeated every opponent who came forward. He became famous for it. And he refused to renounce it, even when influential men offered him patronage in exchange for giving it up. He said that without this argument, he had nothing to teach. For over 2,000 years, philosophers have been trying to figure out exactly what he meant, whether he was right, and whether the question even matters. Tonight, we are going to find out. But before we do, we need to understand the world Gongsun Long was born into. A world so shattered by war, so desperate for order, so confused about the meaning of words themselves, that the question, what does this name actually refer to, was not merely academic. It was a matter of life, death, and political survival. We are going to travel into the Warring States period of ancient China, one of the most intellectually extraordinary eras in human history. We will meet the first lawyer who died for arguing both sides of every case. We will walk beside two philosophers on a riverbank, arguing about whether fish can be happy, and what any of us can possibly know about anything. We will encounter paradoxes that sound like jokes and turn out to be genuine problems about the nature of reality. We will ask whether a thing that has no thickness can still stretch for 1,000 miles. We will ask whether the sun begins to set the moment it reaches noon. We will ask what it means to say you know something, and whether you can separate the hardness of a stone from its whiteness, and whether heaven and earth are, at some level, a single body. And underneath all of that, we will find the question that runs through every chapter of this story. When words fail, when the names we use no longer match the things they are supposed to describe, what happens to the world? This is maybe meaning. If you find yourself wanting more of this kind of journey, consider subscribing. There is always another question waiting. And now let us begin. To understand why a group of ancient Chinese philosophers became obsessed with language, you have to understand what was happening around them. The Warring States period lasted roughly from 479 BCE to 200 and 210 BCE. That is more than 2.5 centuries of almost continuous war. 7 major states, Qin, Chu, Yan, Han, Wei, Zhao, and Qi, competed for dominance over a fragmented China. Armies clashed constantly. Alliances formed and collapsed within a generation. States that existed for centuries were extinguished in a single campaign season. Entire populations were destroyed or displaced. One estimate suggests that the Qin campaigns alone killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers in single battles. And yet, here is the thing that makes this era so strange and so important. For the middle of all this destruction, China produced some of the greatest philosophy in human history. The Chinese call it the period of the 100 schools of thought. Confucius, Mencius, Laozi, Zhuangzi, Mozi, Xunzi, Han Fei, thinkers whose ideas would shape Chinese civilization for the next 2,000 years, all lived during or just before or during this era of chaos. They were, in a real sense, responding to the chaos. Each school offered a different diagnosis of what had gone wrong, and a different prescription for how to fix it. The Confucians said the problem was a collapse of moral order. People had stopped behaving according to the proper relationships between ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife. Restore those relationships, practice the rituals that express them, and society would heal. The Taoists said the problem was that humans had strayed from the natural flow of things, the Tao, the way. Stop forcing, stop naming, stop arguing. Let things be what they are. The Mohists were perhaps more practical. They argued for universal love and calculated utility. Help people because helping people produces the greatest benefit for the greatest number. Warfare is wrong because it destroys more than it creates. The legalists said all of the above was naive idealism. What states needed was strict law, clear punishment, and a ruler strong enough to enforce both without sentiment. In the middle of all these schools, debating against them and sometimes with them, was a looser collection of thinkers who shared one common obsession. They were obsessed with language itself, with the names of things, with the gap between what a word is supposed to mean and what it actually points to in the world, with the way that language could be used to clarify reality or just as easily to distort it beyond recognition. These thinkers came to be called by historians of a later dynasty the Míngjiā, the school of names. They were never a formal school. They did not gather in one place or share a single doctrine. Some were aristocratic advisors, some were wandering debaters who sold their skills to courts and ministers. Some were genuine philosophical reformers, some were, at least in the eyes of their critics, clever sophists who argued for the pleasure of winning rather than for the love of truth. What connected them was a single question that none of them could leave alone. What is a name actually for? In Chinese, the word for name is Ming, and the thing that a name points to, the stuff in the world, the object, the situation, the event, there, is she, Ming and she, word and reality, name and thing. The question was whether these two ever truly line up, and if they do not, what are the consequences? It sounds abstract, it was not. In a world where rulers issued commands, generals gave orders, ministers argued over policy, and courts decided who lived and who died, the precision of a word could determine everything. A command that used the wrong name could start a war. A law written with imprecise terms could be exploited by anyone clever enough to find the gap between the letter and the spirit. A title assigned to the wrong person corroded the entire system of social relations that held civilization together. Confucius himself understood this. When a student asked him what the very first thing he would do if he were given a government to run, Confucius said, the first thing he would do is rectify the names. Make sure that what things are called corresponds to what they actually are. Because if names are wrong, he said, speech is not in accord with truth. And if speech is not in accord with truth, affairs cannot be accomplished. And if affairs cannot be accomplished, everything falls apart. The Confucians had one answer to that problem. Correct the names. Align words with moral and social reality. Enforce the right use of terms through ritual, education, and discipline. The school of names had a different answer. Or rather, they had a question. Before you can correct the names, they said, you have to understand how names work. What is the relationship between a name and the thing it names? Can you ever fully capture reality in a word? And what does it reveal about the world when you try? That was the project, and it began with a man who died for it. The story of the School of Names begins with Deng Zhi. He was born around 45 BCE in the state of Zheng. He was a contemporary of Confucius of Dre, though the two men could hardly have represented more different visions of what thinking was for. Confucius believed that language should affirm moral order. Deng Zhi believed that language was a tool, and that any skilled craftsman could use a tool to do almost anything, including take apart the structures that other people had built with it. Deng Zhi was by most accounts the first professional lawyer in Chinese history. He taught legal argumentation, he took on cases, he charged his clients for his services, a coat for a major case, a pair of trousers for a minor one. He became wealthy, which tells you something about how many people needed what he offered. What made him extraordinary and dangerous was the principle at the heart of his practice. He called it lang qi, double admissibility. The idea that in any dispute, it was possible to construct equally valid arguments on both sides. That right and wrong were not fixed points, but positions you could reach by different paths, depending on how you framed the question and which words you chose. An ancient text records a story about him that captures this perfectly. A wealthy man had drowned in a river. A fisherman recovered the body. The wealthy man's family came to buy it back. The fisherman demanded an enormous price. The family was outraged and went to Deng Zhi for advice. Deng Zhi told them, be calm. There is no one else the fisherman can sell it to. The fisherman heard about this advice and also went to Deng Zhi, worried the family would simply wait him out. Deng Zhi told him, be calm. There is no one else they can buy it from, advising both sides of the same case in direct contradiction. And he saw no problem with this, because, from one angle, both things were true. His rival was the chief minister of Zheng, a man named Zichan, who believed in clear laws and clear authority. Deng Xi drove Zichan to the edge of his patience. Every time Zichan issued a new law, Deng Xi would find a way around it. Zichan decreed that people could not post political writings in public. Deng Xi had his students deliver the writings to people's homes. Zichan decreed that no one could deliver writings either. Deng Xi found another way. It was, the ancient records say, endless. The state of Zheng fell into disorder. The people were confused about what was admissible and what was not, and the authorities blamed Deng Xi. He was executed in 500 BCE. And here is the irony that the ancient texts note almost with a sense of dark comedy. The ruler who had him killed then adopted his legal code, the bamboo law of Da, the alternative system of statutes that Deng Xi had written Vra, became the law of Zheng after its author was dead. He was executed for showing that the law was uncertain. His law then replaced the one that killed him. What Deng Xi had discovered, or perhaps demonstrated, is something that every legal system has to confront eventually. A law is made of words. Words are imprecise. The gap between what a law says and what a law means is not a flaw that can be fixed with better drafting. It is built into the nature of language itself. You can try to close the gap with more words, but more words create more gaps. The problem does not end. Deng Xi was the first person in Chinese history to make this point systematically and professionally. He paid for it with his life. And the question he raised, Fra, whether there is ever a fact of the matter about what a word means, Fra, never went away. A generation after Deng Xi, somewhere in the middle of the 4th century BCE, two men became friends in a way that neither of them could quite explain. Their names were Zhuangzi and Hui Shi. If you know anything about ancient Chinese philosophy, you probably know Zhuangzi Vra, one of the most vivid and strange and beautiful writers in the history of human thought. His book, the Zhuangzi, is full of stories about butterflies and dreams, cooks who butcher oxen with transcendent skill, enormous fish that transform into birds, and sages who laugh at death. He was a Taoist in the deepest sense. He believed that the categories we use to understand the world are human constructions, and that wisdom lies in releasing your grip on them and letting reality flow as it actually is. Hui Shi was almost his opposite, in method if not in temperament. Where Zhuangzi sought to dissolve distinctions through metaphor and story, Hui Shi drove them apart through rigorous argument. He was a logician who had read everything Vrad. His library reportedly filled 5 cartloads of books Vrad, and a politician who served as Prime Minister of the state of Wei. He was brilliant, systematic, and according to Zhuangzi, still somehow missing the point. And yet they were close, perhaps the closest friends either of them had. But Zhuangzi is full of their arguments. They walk, they sit by rivers, they look at things, verdure, fish, trees, mountains, verdure, and immediately disagree about what can be known about them. Zhuangzi says something poetic and inexhaustible. Hui Shi fires back with a precise logical objection. Zhuangzi sidesteps or turns the objection inside out, and neither of them convinces the other, and somehow the friendship deepens anyway. The most famous of their exchanges happened on a bridge over the Hao River. Zhuangzi was watching the fish dart through the water. He said, "See how the minnows swim about, following the openings wherever they take them. That is what fish really enjoy." Hui Shi said, "You are not a fish. How can you know what fish enjoy?" Zhuangzi said, "You are not me. How can you know that I do not know what fish enjoy?" Hui Shi said, "I am not you, to be sure, so I do not know what it is to be you. But by the same token, since you are certainly not a fish, my point about your inability to know what fish enjoy stands intact." Zhuangzi said, "Let us go back to the beginning. You asked me how I know what fish enjoy. When you asked that question, you already knew that I knew. I knew it from up here, standing above the Hao River. Now, who won that argument? It depends on what you think the argument was about." Hui Shi's point is epistemological in a very strict sense. He is asking, on what basis do you claim to know something about the inner experience of an entirely different kind of creature? By what evidence? Through what method? The question is legitimate. Without some way of bridging the gap between your experience and the fish's experience, any claim to know what fish feel is simply assertion vreg or projection. Zhuangzi's response operates on a different level entirely. He does not answer the epistemological question directly. Instead, he points to the act of questioning itself. Huishi asked, "How do you know Vra?" which presupposes that knowing is possible in some form, even if disputable in this particular case. And Zhuangzi grounds his knowledge not in method or argument, but in place and presence. Standing above the river, being here, the fish and I are both in the same world, breathing the same moment. The exchange is also, on one level, purely a pun. The Chinese word hui shi used when he asked, "How do you know?" Va, the word an, meaning from where va, can also mean in what state or from what position. Zhuangzi catches the ambiguity and uses it. Hui shi intended it as a challenge to Zhuangzi's epistemological claim. Zhuangzi takes the word literally and answers, "I know from here, from this position, from the bridge." This is a small, perfect example of what the School of Names was actually doing. They were showing that language is not a transparent window onto the world. Every word carries multiple possible meanings. Every sentence that sounds like one question is actually several questions at once. And how you answer depends entirely on which question you heard. Hui Shi's 10 paradoxes work on the same principle of drag. Not to confuse for the sake of confusion, but to reveal the hidden assumptions inside words we think we understand. He said the largest thing has nothing beyond it. Call it the great one. He said the smallest thing has nothing within it. Call it the small one. He said, what has no thickness cannot be piled up, and yet it can extend for 1,000 miles. He said, the sun at noon is the sun in decline. The thing born is the thing dying. He said, mountains and marshes are on the same level. He said, I set off for you today and arrived there yesterday. He said, linked rings can be separated. He said, I know the center of the world. It is north of Yan and south of you. He said, let love embrace the 10,000 things. Heaven and earth are one body. Each of these sounds on first reading like a riddle or a joke, but each one contains a genuine philosophical pressure point. Take the paradox about thickness. If you take a surface that has no thickness at all, drag, a mathematical plane, a pure two-dimensional abstraction vra, you cannot pile copies of it on top of each other and create a height. No matter how many planes you stack, zero thickness times any number is still zero. And yet that plane, stretched infinitely in two directions, extends for more than 1,000 miles. So something can be simultaneously incapable of forming a height and yet capable of occupying an enormous span. What kind of size are we even measuring? Or take the paradox of the sun at noon. The moment the sun reaches its highest point, it has already begun to fall. In the very instant of its maximum height, it is already in decline. There is no duration of high noon. There is only a boundary point between rising and falling, and that point has no extension in time. The same is true of a living creature. In the moment of birth, the process of dying has already begun. Life and death are not two separate states with a clear line between them. They are simultaneous. Hui Shi's final statement, Vra, let love embrace all 10,000 things. Heaven and earth are one body, Vra, is not a paradox in the logical sense. It is the conclusion his paradoxes are leading toward. If every distinction we make draw big and small, far and near, then and now, high and low Vra, is relative to a perspective rather than absolute, then reality at the most fundamental level is undivided. The categories we use are useful, but they are not written into the world. They are written into the minds of the creatures doing the looking. And if that is true, then the appropriate emotional response to reality might not be the careful discrimination of things and their differences. It might be something closer to love, Vra, a recognition of the underlying unity beneath all the names we give to things. Zhuangzi, listening to all of this, must have felt a complicated kind of recognition. Hui Shi was reaching towards something real, but Zhuangzi thought his friend was still trapped inside the instrument he was trying to transcend. You cannot argue your way out of language by using more language. At some point, you have to let go. When Hui Shi died, Zhuangzi walked past his grave. He told his attendants a story. There was once a plasterer, he said, who had a friend who was a carpenter. The plasterer would get specks of mud on the tip of his nose, and the carpenter Vra, his close friend Vra, would take his axe and swing it with such speed and precision that the mud would fly off without any injury to the nose. The plasterer stood completely still, completely trusting while the blade moved. It worked every time. When a lord heard of this and asked the carpenter to demonstrate the skill on him, the carpenter refused. He said, I was once able to do this, but the one I worked with has been gone for many years. The story is a way of saying, I have lost the one person whose mind moved in exactly the right way to sharpen mine. I have no one left to argue with. That is the kind of friendship the School of Names was built on. Two minds moving in opposite directions, each making the other more precise. Gongsun Long was born around 320 BCE, which makes him roughly a generation younger than Hui Shi. He came from the state of Zhao and spent much of his life as a retainer to the Lord of Pingyuan, a powerful aristocrat who kept a salon of philosophers and debaters at his court. He was famous as a conversationalist, a debater, a performer of philosophy in front of audiences who came to watch the verbal contests that wealthy courts in that era enjoyed. And he was famous for one argument above all others, grand air. An argument he apparently could defeat any challenger on, an argument he refused to give up no matter the personal cost. A white horse is not a horse. When a Confucian scholar named Kong Chuan came to him and offered to study with him on the condition that he abandoned this thesis, Gongsun Long declined. Without this argument, he said, "I have nothing to teach." So what did he mean? The dialogue he left behind, Vrada. The white horse dialogue, Vrada, is structured as a debate between two unnamed speakers. One proposes the thesis, the other raises objections. The objections are not straw men. They are real difficulties that any careful thinker would raise, and the responses are precise. The first argument is this: horse denotes a shape, white denotes a color. Denoting a color is not the same as denoting a shape. Therefore, white horse is not the same as horse. The second argument is perhaps more intuitive. If you send someone to fetch a horse, they can bring back a yellow horse or a brown horse. That counts. Any horse will do. But if you send them to fetch a white horse, a yellow horse will not count. A brown horse will not count. The set of things that satisfy white horse is a proper subset of the set of things that satisfy horse. They are not the same set. Therefore, white horse is not horse. The third argument goes deeper still. Horse as a name does not select for any particular color. It applies to yellow horses and black horses and white horses equally. But white horse does select for color. It excludes anything that is not white. A name that excludes color is different in its function from a name that includes a specific color. They cannot be identical. Now, the objection is immediate and obvious. Of course, white horses are horses. Walk into any stable. A white horse is standing there. It is a horse. You could ride it. You could feed it carrots. The category horse clearly applies to it. Gongsun Long cannot be denying something this obvious. He is not. The question is not whether white horses fall within the biological category of horse. The question is whether the name white horse is identical to the name horse. And the answer, carefully stated, is no. They are different names that pick out different sets of things. The set of white horses and the set of horses are related. Vrei one contains the other vrei, but they are not the same set. A name that picks out a larger set and a name that picks out a smaller set within it are not the same name. This might seem like a very fine point, but consider what follows from it. In the ancient Chinese world, the names given to things in official contexts had enormous practical weight. A horse of a certain color, requisitioned under a certain name for a certain military purpose, had a specific legal status. If a white horse was delivered when a horse was requested, was the requisition fulfilled? If your answer is yes, obviously, a horse is a horse. Then you have made a claim about the relationship between names and reality that might seem obvious, but is actually a decision, Vrand. A decision about how loosely or tightly you want language to bind to the world. Gongsun Long was also working towards something more philosophical. In his essay on hardness and whiteness, he takes the argument in a direction that moves from logic toward metaphysics. Imagine a stone that is both hard and white. You see it. You say, "This is a hard white stone." But consider, when you look at the stone, you perceive its whiteness through your eyes, but you cannot perceive its hardness through your eyes. When you touch it, you perceive its hardness through your hands, but you cannot perceive its whiteness through your hands. So at any given moment, the hardness and the whiteness are never simultaneously present in the same act of perception. You access one quality through one sense and another through a different sense. They are never given together in a single act of knowing. From this, Gongsun Long concludes that hardness and whiteness are separate reducta, separate from the stone and separate from each other. They exist independently. as what we might call universals, a kind of platonic quality that is not simply the property of any one stone, but something that can attach itself to many different things in many different situations. This is a genuinely radical philosophical claim, and it makes Gongsun Long one of the most unusual thinkers in the entire classical Chinese tradition. Chinese philosophy was almost uniformly focused on the practical vray, on ethics, governance, and social relations. Gongsun Long was asking questions that had no practical application whatsoever. He was asking what qualities are, how universals and particulars relate, and whether the categories we use to organize experience have any independent existence. The historian Fan Yulan, writing in the 20th century, compared this to Plato's theory of forms. Whether that comparison holds in all its details is debatable, but the underlying instinct is recognizable. There is something about whiteness that is not exhausted by any particular white thing. The whiteness of this paper and the whiteness of snow are both white, but neither of them is whiteness itself. Gongsun Long thought that was worth thinking about. He thought it was the most important thing a philosopher could think about in a world where words and the things they named had come so badly apart. Let us step back from the paradoxes for a moment and think about what was at stake. The Warring States period was, among other things, a crisis of legitimacy. Each of the competing states had rulers, and each ruler had titles, and each title was supposed to correspond to a certain kind of person who behaved in a certain kind of way. A king was supposed to act like a king. A minister was supposed to act like a minister. A general was supposed to act like a general. When people with those titles did not act in ways that matched their names, the whole social fabric stretched and tore. This is why Confucius made the rectification of names the foundation of good governance. If a ruler does not act like a ruler, do not call him a ruler. If a minister acts with the virtue of a true minister, recognize that in the way you name and treat him. The name should track the reality. When it does not, everyone is confused, relationships break down, and eventually the state falls. But who decides what a ruler is supposed to act like? The Confucians had an answer vague. You look to the ancient kings, to the established rituals, to the moral framework that has been transmitted through generations. You correct the names by referring to an authoritative tradition. The school of names pushed on exactly this assumption. You say the name should track the reality. But what is the reality? Reality does not come pre-labeled. The world does not arrive divided into named categories. The categories are human choices, and those choices are never innocent. Every name carves the world at a particular joint, for a particular reason, from a particular perspective. Consider a tree. You call it a tree. But a botanist has a more specific name for it. A poet has a different relationship to it entirely. A carpenter sees it as lumber. An ecologist sees it as part of a network. None of these is simply wrong. Each name opens certain things up and closes others down. Now multiply this problem across every object, every relationship, every social role, every political concept in an entire civilization. The latermost jar a school of rigorous logicians who were roughly contemporaneous with the school of names and often debated them tried to solve the problem through systematic analysis. They developed what amounted to a classification theory of language. Names, they argued, can be divided into types. Some names pick out kinds of things that share a shape and appearance for D. These are the most stable. Some names are so general they apply to almost everything. Some names apply to a single, unique individual. You can have rules for when a name applies correctly and when it does not. Language can be made precise. The school of names was more skeptical. Rishi's paradoxes kept showing that precision breaks down at the edges, at the very large and the very small, at the boundaries between categories, at the moment of transition between states. The clean lines blur. Gongsun Long's paradoxes showed something slightly different, that even in ordinary cases, the relationship between a name and what it names is more complicated than it seems. White horse and horse are both perfectly ordinary phrases. Every Chinese speaker in 300 BCE knew what each of them meant, and yet when you examine exactly how they work differently. The assumption that two names that overlap must be identical collapses under scrutiny. What the school of names was doing in the deepest sense was making philosophical difficulty out of things that people assumed were simple. This is not a trivial service. Much of the damage done in human history of drag by bad law by political propaganda, by the sloppy use of moral categories. Vradag comes from treating complicated things as if they were simple, treating a complex human being as if they were simply defined by a single name, treating a nuanced ethical situation as if it fell cleanly on one side of a binary. The philosophers of the school of names were irritating. Sunzi, the great Confucian, dismissed them as people who were clever but useless, eloquent but without practical value, capable of saying interesting things but incapable of contributing to the actual work of building a society. He hated them with a very particular Confucian contempt, vray. The contempt of someone who believes that philosophy should serve human relationships, and who watched these men spend their energy on problems that seemed to have nothing to do with how people should live. But Sunzi also took them seriously enough to respond. He could not simply ignore them, because if their arguments were right, if names really were as uncertain and context-dependent as they suggested, then the entire Confucian project of rectifying names was built on sand. You cannot fix a name if there is no fact of the matter about what the right name is. This is the tension that runs through the entire era, and it is a tension that has not been resolved, vradag, not in Chinese philosophy and not in any other tradition, because it is in the end a tension about what language is for. Is language primarily a tool for coordinating social action? Then precision matters, and uncertain or slippery language is a problem to be fixed. Or is language primarily an attempt to describe reality? Then the limitations of language tell us something important about reality itself, about the fact that the world does not divide itself into the categories we impose on it. The school of names, in their various ways, kept pushing toward the second possibility, and the implications of that possibility are still alive in every argument we have about the meaning of words. I want to spend some time with the other paradoxes vragi, the 21 that the ancient text called under heaven preserves beyond Hui Shi's 10. These are attributed to various unnamed disputers within the school, and they are stranger and more beautiful than they might first appear. Consider this one. The shadow of a flying bird never moves. Your instinct is to say, of course it moves. Watch a bird fly over a field on a sunny day. The shadow follows underneath it, sliding across the grass. It moves. But the paradox is asking something more careful. At any single instant, at any moment you choose to freeze and examine the shadow is where it is. It is not moving. Motion, as Zeno of Elea had realized in ancient Greece around the same time, is not a property of any single instance. It is something that requires a comparison between instants. It requires time. But if you stop time at any point, if you take a single perfect frozen cross-section of the world, nothing is moving. Everything is exactly where it is, no more and no less. So the paradox is pointing to something real about the relationship between time and motion. Motion is not a thing that exists at a moment. It is a relationship between moments. And our ordinary language makes it sound as if motion is a property of things the way color or shape is a property of things, but it is not. It is a higher order relationship. This connects to a cluster of paradoxes about infinity and continuity. A 1-foot stick, taken half away each day, will not be exhausted in 10,000 generations. This is the same insight Zeno had with his tortoise and Achilles. If you keep halving a finite length, you can keep doing it forever. You will never reach zero. You can always cut the remaining piece in half again. The series is infinite. In that sense, the stick never reaches nothing. And yet we know from physical experience that if you keep cutting a stick, eventually you will reach a point where nothing is left. So is the series finite or infinite? The mathematical answer is that it is an infinite series whose sum converges to a finite value. But the paradox is pointing to the gap between our mathematical abstraction and our physical intuition and asking which one we should trust. If you go to UA today, you have arrived there yesterday. This paradox is more about the relativity of temporal description than about infinity. If you begin your journey today, then by the time you arrive, you are already in the future relative to your departure. But from the perspective of the moment of arrival, your departure was in the past. So depending on which moment you use as your reference point, the departure and arrival shift their temporal relationships. The past and the future are not fixed properties of events. They are relational vogue. They describe where an event stands relative to some other event. Fire is not hot. This sounds outrageous. Touch fire. It is obviously hot. But the paradox is pointing to a distinction that philosophy would take 2,000 years to fully work out. Hotness as we experience it is a quality in our experience of Da, a sensation in our nerves. Fire itself, as a physical process of rapid oxidation, does not have hotness the way a property belongs to a thing. Hotness is the name for what happens when fire interacts with a heat-sensitive organism. Without the sensing body, there is no heat volume, only temperature, which is a different kind of description entirely. Eyes do not see. Again, obviously they do. But again, the paradox is pointing somewhere real. Eyes are physical organs. They receive light. They transmit signals. But the seeing vrang, the experience of color, shape, depth, meaning vrang, happens somewhere else, in a process that we still do not fully understand. The eye is the instrument. The seeing is not the same as the instrument. The center of the world is north of Yan and south of Yue. Yan was the northernmost state in ancient China. Yue was the southernmost. So to say the center of the world is north of the northernmost place and south of the southernmost place sounds like saying it is nowhere at all, but it is actually saying something more interesting. That center is relative to perspective. If the world is infinite in extent, then any point is equidistant from some imagined boundary in every direction. Every point can be the center. Or Vda, to put it differently, Vda, there is no privileged center at all. The center of the world is not a feature of the world. It is a description we project onto the world based on where we are standing. All of these paradoxes are doing the same kind of work. They are taking ordinary concepts, vraja, motion, time, heat, vision, spatial position, vra, and showing that when you examine them carefully, they do not work the way we assume they do. They are not simple properties of simple things. They are relational, contextual, perspective-dependent. This is, as it turns out, a very modern insight. The physics of the 20th century confirmed, in a much more rigorous way, that concepts like simultaneity, position, velocity, and even time itself are not absolute features of the universe, but are observer-dependent. The clock that moves runs slower. Two events that are simultaneous for one observer are not simultaneous for another. The universe does not come pre-carved into the categories that our language suggests. The paradoxes of ancient China did not have calculus or relativity theory. They had something else. A very careful attention to the way that ordinary language smuggles in assumptions that turn out to be warranted. And they used that attention to crack open concepts that everyone around them treated as settled and obvious. In 221 BCE, the state of Qin completed its conquest of all the other warring states and unified China under the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. The first emperor was a legalist. He believed in the power of clear law, strict punishment, centralized control, and the elimination of anything that introduced ambiguity or dissent. In 213 BCE, he ordered the burning of books vra, all texts that were not of practical utility, all philosophy that was not legalist, all history that was not written from the approved point of view. In 1202 BCE, he had scholars buried alive. The school of names did not survive this. Their texts vra, almost all of them vra, were destroyed. What remained was fragmentaria. The works of Hui Shi, who may have written brilliantly, are entirely lost except for the 10 paradoxes preserved in the Zhuangzi. The works of Gongsun Long survive only in a small collection, parts of which later scholars believe were forged or edited beyond recognition. The tradition died so completely that by the time the Han Dynasty scholars tried to categorize the intellectual heritage of the Warring States period, the school of names was already largely a mystery. They were labeled sophists. Their work was called idle wordplay. The paradoxes were dismissed as clever but useless. This judgment persisted for 2,000 years. It was only in the 20th century, as Western-educated Chinese scholars began to bring the tools of analytic philosophy and formal logic to bear on ancient Chinese texts, that the school's real depth became visible. Thinkers like Feng Yulan and scholars like Angus Graham and A.C. Graham began to take the paradoxes seriously vrock, not as rhetorical tricks, but as genuine philosophical arguments that were engaging with real problems in the theory of language, reference, and reality, and what they found was remarkable. The school of names was not doing what their critics said they were doing. They were not simply arguing for the pleasure of winning. They were not deliberately making language meaningless. They were doing something much more serious and much more difficult. They were trying to understand how language works and what its limits are and what those limits reveal about the nature of the world. The question of whether a white horse is a horse is not, in the end, a question about horses. It is a question about what names do. Whether a name picks out a kind of thing in the world, or whether it picks out a set of things defined by conditions that may or may not coincide with any natural division in the world. It is a question that is still actively debated in the philosophy of language, in mathematics, in cognitive science, and in every argument about how to define a concept clearly enough to reason about it. The paradoxes of infinity, Vrag, the stick that can never be fully halved, the bird's shadow that never moves, Vrag, anticipate problems that required the invention of calculus to handle formally, and that are still not fully resolved in the philosophy of mathematics. The question of whether hotness is a property of fire or a property of the interaction between fire and a sensing body is a question about primary and secondary qualities that occupied John Locke, George Berkeley, Naun, and David Hume in the 17th and 18th centuries, and that remains live in the philosophy of perception today. The insight that the center of the world is relative to the observer draw, that spatial and temporal descriptions are not absolute but perspective-dependent of draw, is, in its deep structure, related to the relativism of reference frames that Einstein formalized in the early 20th century. These are not coincidences of content. They are convergences of philosophical attention. When you look hard enough at the ordinary words you use every day of dr, horse, white, hard, hot, center, now, shadow of dr, they start to tremble. The categories that seemed fixed turn out to be chosen. The concepts that seemed simple turn out to contain layers. The world that seemed to be neatly divided into the things we named turns out to be continuous, relational, and indifferent to our labels. The school of names looked at that and did not look away. There is a thread that runs through all of this, Vra, through Deng Xi arguing both sides of the same case, through Hui Xi's paradoxes about time and space, through Gongsun Long's patient dismantling of the identity between white horse and horse, through the anonymous paradoxes about shadows and fire and the eyes that do not see. The thread is this: language is not transparent. We speak as if words were windows onto the world, Vra, as if naming something gave you access to it, as if calling something right made it right, as if the categories we use divided the world along its actual seams. But the school of names kept showing that this is an illusion. Words are tools, they do certain things and not others. They pick out certain aspects of the world and leave others in the dark. They impose boundaries where the world offers gradients. They freeze what is always in motion. They separate what is fundamentally connected. And here is where the school of names becomes most philosophically dangerous and most philosophically interesting. If names are not transparent, direct, if the categories we use are chosen rather than discovered, Varek, then who chooses them? And chosen for what purpose? In the Warring States context, this was not an abstract question. The powerful chose the names. The ruler named the crime and the criminal. The minister defined what counted as loyalty. The winning side in a war got to name the losing side's actions as rebellion rather than resistance, as lawlessness rather than justice. Deng Xi understood this. That is why he taught ordinary people to use language strategically to find the gap between the official name and the actual situation, to use that gap to argue for a different outcome. He was not arguing that truth does not exist. He was arguing that the official version of truth is always a construction vrai, and that it can be questioned. This was dangerous. The state could not function if everyone questioned the official names. The state needed its categories to stick. It needed admissible to mean what the ruler said it meant, and inadmissible to mean what the ruler said that meant. When Deng Xi kept finding ways around the official language, he was not just being clever, he was threatening the entire logic of authority. So they killed him. Gongsun Long, in a quieter way, was doing something similar. He was showing that the word horse does not have a natural, God-given, self-evident reference. It is a name that humans made up to carve a certain piece of reality. A different carving, Vrag, white horse, Vrag, cuts differently. Neither carving is simply wrong, but treating them as identical is a mistake that has consequence. Especially in a world where legal obligations, military requisitions, and social hierarchies were organized around the names you used. Hui Shi went further still. He pointed toward the possibility that the deepest truth about the world is that it is one, that all the distinctions we make vrag, large and small, now and then, here and there, this and that vrag, are relative to perspective, and that there is a level at which they dissolve. And if that is right, then the project of rectifying names vrag, finding the one correct word for the one correct thing vrag, is not just difficult. It is fundamentally misguided, because reality does not come in the form of separate, distinctly named things. These are not comfortable conclusions. They do not tell you how to run a government, or how to treat your family, or what to do when two states go to war. They offer no practical program. They solve no urgent political problem. But they do something else. They make you uncertain about the certainty you arrived with. They make the word horse a more complicated thing than it was before you started reading. They make you wonder whether the categories that seem most obvious to you, dire, the categories that structure your political views, your moral judgments, your scientific concepts, your personal identity, dire, are as fixed and as natural as you assumed. And if they are not they, if they are choices made from a particular perspective, for particular reasons, under particular historical conditions via, then what follows from that? The School of Names never answered that question. They posed it, illuminated it, made it feel urgent, and then their texts were burned, and their tradition was extinguished, but the question survived in fragments, in the 10 paradoxes preserved in someone else's book, in the white horse argument copied out by critics who wanted to refute it, in the fish who may or may not have been happy, swimming in a river that two friends were crossing on a bridge in ancient China. And here is what I find most striking about all of it. Zhuangzi, standing at Huixi's grave, says he has lost the one person he could argue with. The best philosophers of the School of Names did not just enjoy their arguments in the way that a debater enjoys winning. They needed the argument. They needed the person on the other side who would push back hard enough to make the thinking better. Because here is the thing about a genuine philosophical question. It does not resolve when one side wins. It resolves vraj to whatever degree it can vraj when both sides are pushed hard enough that something deeper than both of them becomes visible. The white horse is not a horse, and it is a horse. Both of these things are true in different senses. The paradox does not dissolve when you say that vraj opens. What does it mean for something to be true in different senses? What does it mean for a word to mean two things at once? What does it mean to have a conversation in which both speakers are using the same words and talking about entirely different things? Every argument you have ever had about a concept for variety, justice, freedom, love, rights, harm for buyer, has this structure. You and the person you are arguing with both use the same word, and you are not talking about the same thing. And neither of you quite realizes it until the argument has gone on long enough that the real disagreement surfaces underneath the terminological one. The School of Names was teaching people to notice that moment, to slow down in exactly the place where everyone else rushes forward. To ask, wait for D, what do we mean by this word? And once you ask that question carefully enough, everything becomes more uncertain and more interesting and more true. The Qin dynasty lasted 15 years. The book burning and the burying of scholars turned out to be, in the long view of history, a catastrophic failure of political imagination. You cannot actually burn a question. You can scatter the people who were asking it. But the question persists in the material of the world itself, vragyu, in the gap between every word and what it points to, in the uncertainty at the edge of every category, in the minnow darting through the Hao River while two philosophers argue about what can be known. In the centuries after the Qin collapsed and the Han dynasty rebuilt Chinese intellectual life, scholars tried to reconstruct what had been lost. The School of Names was classified, named, given a chapter in the histories of thought, but they were rarely revived in any living way. Their questions were too unsettling. Their methods were too uncommitted to any practical program. Chinese philosophy moved toward synthesis vare, toward the blending of Confucianism with Taoist and Buddhist ideas, toward systems that could organize a civilization rather than unsettle one. The paradoxes remained, embedded in the text of the Zhuangzi, which survived because it was loved as literature even by those who were suspicious of its philosophy. The white horse argument survived because it was cited vra, usually to be refuted vra by scholars who could not quite leave it alone. And in the 20th century, something interesting happened. Western-trained scholars of Chinese philosophy began to read these fragments with tools that the classical Chinese tradition had not developed. Formal logic, set theory, the philosophy of language in the analytic tradition, and the history of Western philosophy from Plato through Frege, through Wittgenstein. What they found when they applied these tools was that the school of names had been doing real philosophy, difficult, subtle, technically sophisticated philosophy that could hold a conversation with Zeno, with Plato, with Russell, with Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, in his later work, argued that meaning is not determined by some ideal correspondence between words and the world, but by use for Jack, by the patterns of practice in which a word is embedded, by the language games in which it functions. A word means what it means because of how it is used, not because it captures some fixed essence. Gongsun Long, in his way, was making a related point. The word horse means what it means in the context of its use. In a context where any horse will do, bring me a horse and bring me a white horse at different requests. In a context where only white horses matter, the identity or non-identity of the two names becomes practically consequential. The meaning is not fixed by some abstract relationship between the name and the world. It is shaped by what is at stake and Huishi's insight of Dry, that all distinctions are relative, that large and small and now and then are perspectival of Dry, maps onto a genuinely modern understanding of measurement and reference frames. You cannot say something is large without specifying what it is large relative to. You cannot say something is happening now without specifying who's now. The universe does not have a universal time or a universal spatial grid. It has observers, each with their own perspective. These convergences do not mean that the school of names was right about everything, or that they anticipated modern physics in any literal sense. What they mean is that careful attention to ordinary language, pushed hard enough, runs into the same problems in any era and any culture, because the problems are not cultural, they are structural. They are built into the relationship between the finite instruments of human language and the infinite complexity of the world those instruments are trying to map. The school of names did not win their debate. Gongsun Long did not convince China that a white horse is not a horse. Huishi did not persuade his contemporaries to abandon all distinctions in the name of universal love. Dengji did not establish that every legal question has two equally valid answers. But they posed something that cannot be refuted, only ignored. They posed the gap between the name and the thing, the gap between the word and the world, the gap between what we say and what we mean and what we are actually pointing at. And that gap, wrong, once you have seen it wrong, does not close. I want to end where we began, more or less. On the bridge over the Hao River, two philosophers watching fish. We talked about that exchange early on, Vrong Zhuangzi and Huishi, arguing about whether Zhuangzi can know what fish enjoy. But I want to come back to it now because it contains something we have not quite said. Huishi's question is serious. It is in fact one of the hardest questions in philosophy. How do you know the inner experience of another being? You cannot step inside a fish's consciousness. You cannot verify from the inside what it feels like to be a fish, or whether feels like is even a meaningful phrase to apply to a fish. By what right do you project your concept of happiness Vdra, a human concept, built from human experience Vdra, onto a creature whose nervous system and way of being in the world are entirely different from yours? This question does not only apply to fish, it applies to other people. You cannot step inside another person's experience any more than you can step inside a fish's. You infer what other people feel. You interpret their behavior through your framework, which is built from your experience. When you say someone is happy, you mean something that is shaped by what happiness has meant in your own life. The gap between your concept and their reality is always there. It is only more obvious with the fish. Zhuangzi's answer is that this worry, taken to its logical conclusion, would make all knowledge of the world impossible. If you cannot know anything you cannot verify from the inside, you cannot know whether anything outside your own mind is real. Huishi asks, "How do you know?" in a tone that implies the impossibility of knowing. But his own question presupposes that Zhuangzi knows something vrai. Otherwise, there would be nothing to challenge. And Zhuangzi grounds his knowing in where he is, above the river, watching, present. There is something very important in that move. Zhuangzi is not claiming to have a theory that bridges the gap. He is claiming that being present in the world, vrag, being in relationship with it, attending to it, standing above a river, and watching what moves through it, vrag, is already a form of knowing, not a perfect form, not a form that survives every epistemological challenge, but a form that is real, and that matters, and that is prior to any theory. Huai Shi, for all his brilliance, lives inside theories. His paradoxes are tools for dismantling assumptions. His arguments are precise, but his precision, Zhuangzi suggests, keeps him at a distance from the very thing he is trying to understand. The fish are not a puzzle to be solved. They are moving creatures in a river, and you can know something about them simply by watching them move. This tension is still live. It is the tension between the philosopher who insists that you must first understand the conditions of knowledge before you can claim to know anything, and the philosopher who insists that the demand for perfect conditions is itself a kind of paralysis that prevents you from engaging with the world as it is. The school of names inhabited both sides of this tension. Hui Shi's paradoxes strip away the unexamined assumptions in ordinary knowledge claims. Gongsun Long's arguments force you to be more precise about what you mean when you name something. Deng Xi's legal practice showed that every claim about what is right can be countered by an equally coherent claim about what is right from another angle. But Zhuangzi Crai, who was never quite a member of the school of names, who learned from them and argued with them and mourned them, Vrog points towards something beyond both sides. The point is not to win the epistemological argument. The point is to keep attending, to keep watching the fish, to keep standing on the bridge above the river in the particular hour of a particular afternoon with a friend who will push back on everything you say. That is, in the end, what philosophy is for. Not to settle questions, but to deepen them. To make you stand in the world differently, Vrona, more carefully, more humbly, more attentive to the gap between the word and the thing the word is pointing at. The fish dart through the openings in the water. The shadows of birds move or do not move, depending on how you are counting time. A horse stands in a field, white utterly itself, and the name for it is not quite the thing. It never was. That is the whole story, and somehow it is enough. Sode, for those still awake, if you are still here, Vroge, still following these ideas as the night settles around you, Frog, then something has kept you. Maybe it was the fish, maybe it was the horse, maybe it was Deng Shi charging his clients in clothing and then dying for arguing both sides, and having his law adopted by the state that killed him. The school of names existed for about 250 years in a country that was destroying itself with war. In that destruction, they found time to argue about what words mean. That might seem like the most irrelevant thing in the world. It was, perhaps, the most necessary. Because if you cannot be precise about what you mean when you speak, then everything built on your words vagary. Your laws, your relationships, your moral claims, your political arguments, fragari, is built on something that wobbles. The wobble might not matter most of the time. Things hold together anyway. But when it matters, when the question is genuinely difficult and genuinely consequential, you need to know whether the words you are using are actually tracking what you think they are tracking. Gongsun Long knew this. That is why he refused to give up the white horse argument, even when it cost him. He was not being stubborn. He was insisting that precision matters, that the gap between horse and white horse is real and consequential, that overlooking it is not a small mistake, but the kind of mistake that multiplied across a civilization produces injustice and confusion and the collapse of trust. Hui Shi knew this too, though he reached a different conclusion. If you push the demand for precision far enough, you find that no precision is ever fully adequate for G, that reality overflows every concept, that every border is in some sense arbitrary, that the final word is not a more precise description, but a different kind of attention altogether. And the appropriate response to that might be love. A love that does not carve the world into friend and enemy, valuable and worthless, mine and yours, but that holds it all with the same care. Zhuangzi listened to both of them. He watched them from a slight distance, turning their insights into stories rather than arguments, finding in their intellectual precision a kind of freedom fridae, the freedom that comes from knowing how much you do not know, from being able to let go of the categories that bind you, from watching the fish. They are all gone now. Their words survive in fragments, in quotations by critics who wanted to refute them, in a few chapters of a book that was saved because someone loved the butterflies and the cooks and the autumn floods in it, not because someone wanted to preserve the hard arguments at the end. But the question survives. It always does. What is a horse? What is a white horse? Are they the same? Can you know? From what position are you claiming to know? And what does it reveal about the world Vrandia? About the gap between the name and the thing Vru? That the question is harder than it seemed. You can sleep on that. You do not need to answer it tonight. The river is still there. The fish are still moving. The bridge is still above them. And somewhere above that, the sky is the color it is, with no name quite adequate to it. Good night.